You're listening to the Valley Current.
People who like to sing and paint, and we did a lot of creative things. And when we were very young, my dad taught us to draw what ideas look like. So it was like, what does God look like? What does trust look like? So it was years later that I remembered this. So we were kind of trained in synesthesia at a very young age.
Was your dad religious? Was your family religious? I'm kind of curious because my dad was not about please draw what God looks like, but he did take me to church every Sunday.
Yeah, he did. We were just sort of Protestant, Christian church, very, not anything extreme, kind of like Methodist, not quite Methodist, but similar, Protestant, United Church of Christ. This was completely separate. This was just playing with words and ideas, and he would like make a funny picture and have us put eyes on it. It was just very much about creativity and taking abstraction.
Okay.
And making it concrete. So that was as a child. Then I became a writer. So my sister was the artist and I was the writer.
Okay. 2 sisters? Is that your family? Your father and mother and 2 sisters?
Yeah, 2 sisters and a brother. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were your folks teachers or kind of educators, or what did they do?
How did you know?
Well, usually if someone says, why don't you draw what God is or what trust is, it's probably someone who's an educator would be my guess.
Well, my mom was a teacher. My dad was a chemical technician, but he also sang with the Lamplighters in San Francisco.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you were born in San Francisco?
Yeah, no, in the East Bay.
East Bay. Okay. Yeah. And so your family probably was great at pushing education would be my guess, right?
Yes, it was very important. Books, ideas are always very important. Mm-hmm. Very intellectually interesting environment. Bit eccentric sometimes.
Yes.
But where I picked this up is I was a writer, a reporter for the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat for years. When it was owned by the New York Times, that was fun. We always said we didn't have to go to the New York Times, they came to us. So I was a writer, and then including as an education reporter, environment reporter, had different beats. But then I left reporting right in the late 90s when things were really changing in the business, and I went to work as a researcher for Institute for the Future, IFTF. So very exciting times.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul Sappho is there now, right?
No, he's not now. I think he left, maybe even 15 years ago, 10 or 15.
Paul was a lawyer at Fenwick & West back when I was sort of a partner there trying to get various people to do the work of the firm. And I don't think he lasted very long, but he had greater ambitions and he ended up being, I guess he's now a very sort of high-end futurist, right?
He's, I just call him a quote machine. Mm-hmm. He does represent future thinking in media, in writing. He's brilliant, mm-hmm. And a lovely, lovely man. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So you worked at the Institute for the Future for how many years?
So I was doing, let's see, I worked for about 2 years, and then I was a consultant. So I made this transition into doing the visuals, and here's how that happened.
Okay.
I'm a writer and researcher, and meanwhile, Institute for the Future had David Sibbett, who had worked with Michael Doyle and was one of the very first to make graphic recording a real profession.
Yes.
And so David would, do his writing on the wall, and what they did at IFTF, which is related to the mural we'll be talking about, and I think is really important when we think about the power of visuals, what can they do? At IFTF at that time, they would make these big murals, timeline murals, to see patterns. And if they could see a certain pattern in history, like the relationship between what was happening in society, what's happening with technology, they could carry those patterns into the future and help them do their forecasting.
Yes. I mean, and we're going to put up on the screen because we do have the murals, and you were kind enough to break them into multiple murals. And I want to start with the M mural because I actually have the whole mural here in the large conference room. I've got another one because I got 2 of them from you. Thank you. That were great. You delivered 2 of them. And we put them across the top of the whiteboard. So the whiteboard is essentially got this inspiration above it, which is a ginormous mural, of which this is only about 1/5. I think you have divided, for the purpose of what we're going to do, the entire big mural that must be like 8 feet in length or width. It's about.
Let's see. It is, well, the original mural is 4 feet by 28 feet.
Right. I mean, that's got to be a beautiful thing to see. And we've got kind of a reduced version that I'm guessing is like maybe one, divided by 4, 1 by 7 or something.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Good math.
7 feet across and 1 foot high. And you broke it. And really, it's kind of the story of the last 100+ years or so, with this thing called what will the next paradigm or wave of innovation be, really going into what's now 2020. And you did this mural, I want to say, back in 2015?
It was 2008.
2008.
We did it for the 40th anniversary of Doug Engelbart's Mother of All Demos.
Yes.
Because his theory was of coevolution, that's what would help humanity evolve and be wiser and better. That there'd be a coevolution between culture and technology. So to celebrate the philosophy behind his inventions, I mean, he was known for patenting the mouse, for really showing this great demo, foreshadowing the great innovations of our time. That was in 1968. And so in 2008, my colleague Valerie Landau and I had been working with him to help express the philosophy behind his ideas of coevolution. And so we decided, instead of talking about it, we would show it in this mural that tracked, I don't remember how many streams there are, maybe 15? Everything.
There's a lot of streams and there's a lot of information. I mean, it's literally like compressing the entire story of Silicon Valley into one piece of art. And it really is a piece of art. I mean, you can print it, but it really is something that should make its way, I'm sure it will, into the Smithsonian. Because in many ways, if you had to say to someone visiting Silicon Valley, so what's Silicon Valley about? You put this mural up and both you have the timeline going across it, you got the streams and what looks like these ginormous waves that are happening at different points in time. We're going to show some of it, and we might have to do several podcasts in a row because we limit these things to about 30 or 35 minutes. And even a lot of people say that's too long. But generally, we try to keep them, compressed enough so that people can listen to them and not be bored. And if you look at the mural, and we'll include this in the show notes, there's a lot of data about what is expected to go on. Really, you're predicting kind of like 12 to 15 years forward from 2008 when you do it on the 40th anniversary, as you mentioned. So it's a very dense, beautiful book, and I've had a beautiful picture, and I've had multiple people come in the conference rooms. They say, I've never seen anything like that. What is that? Like, how did it happen? Of course, it was all done by hand. Mm-hmm. And you've been toying with, I think, generally the idea of what will it take for a machine to assist all the hand detail that's done, right?
Well, this is yes, there are different uses for murals. This is really more of a research reporting tool with visuals. So it's something I spent a couple months doing this at O'Reilly Media, Tim O'Reilly.
Yeah.
I live in Bodega Bay, California. He has his office in Sebastopol, and he had a wonderful big wall, and he let me work on it there. And that was great because people would come in, and interesting people, and help us out with that. But this was really research, a lot of research that Valerie and I did
Yes.
All these areas versus the work that I do as a consultant, my bread and butter, which is also delightful, is listening in on meetings and using symbols to capture the gestalt of the conversation, the big ideas.
Right. I mean, I just finished today what actually became an 8-hour mediation where conflicting parties are bucking heads. And in theory, if you were listening to all aspects of that Zoom, it occurred by Zoom because we're still in a pandemic and people are not meeting, which must impact your business to some degree. We'll talk about that. And when you looked at what happened, if you were in all sides of it and we're developing this mural really for the advantage of the mediator who's got to put all this information in his or her head, and that visual would be such a great tool for the future use by him or her as a mediator to trying to get the case settled. And then in the future, if you could redact out the names of the parties and just said the controversy was this, that, and the other thing between X, Y, and Z, those murals would become teaching tools for future lawyers, for law professors, and for judges to understand how these conflicts come up and how they get resolved. But of course, we never do that. Mediators tend to take very few notes. People forget rapidly. They want to forget it rapidly. It's like a very temporary thing. And I keep saying the future of mediation may be to somehow document without disclosing names or numbers or dollars or cents, just the nature of the conflict and how it got resolved. That's a little off subject to this because you actually took what looks like a lot of very patient artwork because you really created this freehand, right?
Yes, but I actually do think that what you're saying is very much related to the mural.
Yes.
And what you're saying is that if you have the proper documentation that's meaningful, not who said what and yada, yada, not the ephemeral momentary, but if you have an idea of the large conflicts, the movements, the feelings, what's really going on in a big sense, then you can help the group itself and you can carry that forward to the next meeting into teaching, as you say. So this that I did about that, Valerie and I, this big mural, reflects Doug Engelbart's belief in just what you said.
Right.
He believed if we had access to the world's knowledge and we could map it and organize it in a meaningful dynamic knowledge repository, is what he called it, you'd be able to solve all the problems of the world.
Right.
But we end up with, that whole idea, everything's miscellaneous, it's disordered. And that bothered Doug till the end of his days, is there's all this information, but it's not mapped and curated in a way that makes sense. Well, the visuals are a little bit, what's the word for it? They're not controversial, because nobody's saying, any of us visual journalists, graphic recorders, we're not saying this is the result, this is the be all and end all. All we're saying is this is what it looks like, and here are the good quotes. So that's what art does. And I'm not saying we're necessarily, in the category of the great artists, but it is art in the sense that it captures a big picture and a feeling, and it's meant to create conversation, not reach conclusions.
Well, I'm kind of curious, you guys must have felt in 2008 like a wave was clearly building, because you obviously decided that sometime within the next 12 or so years, there was really going to be a cresting of the wave. Now, the wave we actually had seems to have been quelled by this pandemic. If anything, maybe the wave has been shocked down or tamped down. Or you could say the opposite, which is, how often would it be that people would be doing so much on video conferencing or using Zoom where they feel comfortable exchanging lots of ideas in ways that before they would say, hey, I'm not putting it on Zoom, I'm not recording it, I'm not doing any of that, come to my office and we could talk about it privately. Maybe things are becoming more open and we are seeing this wave kind of crest that you predicted 12 years ago.
So Jack, I am really curious, before the pandemic,
yes,
so many social movements now, what did you think the wave was before that?
Well, before the pandemic, I always thought that we were going to see artificial intelligence really start to perform things that were surprising. That is, I've always been a believer, and I think you are too, and certainly Doug was, that we want to amplify human intelligence. So it was more intelligence amplify, like IA was more important than artificial intelligence. So there's like Doug's camp, and then there's kind of the McCarthy camp, and I think those camps are very different, right? Doug's camp is we want humans to push the machines in a direction to amplify the humans to create something that's fundamentally more human than machine, versus the McCarthy view that maybe the machine is much smarter than humans and you put enough of them together, and maybe it's more Google's view that the machine can basically do anything. So we could talk to Google, like I could say, hey, Google, what time is it right now? And she can hear it. And she could say it's 4:53 p.m. And, you know, that's a trivial example, but I could start asking more and more questions of what's the weather going to be like, and what's this and what's that. And it becomes conversational, but the machine is almost like more intelligent than me because it can get instant information in ways that I can't, because the machine's not yet embedded in my brain. And there are actually some people that are talking about the machine will eventually maybe become something that is embedded in your brain. And I could give some citations to that literature, but I think Doug was fundamentally of the view that the humans kind of control the machines and the machines will not control the humans. And I think to some degree, I always wondered which way would it go. But I always wanted to believe that Doug would win over McCarthy. And of course, now both of them are dead, so we can't really have this conversation. Ideally, if they were both alive, we'd actually have them in a room and have this conversation. They both recently died, relatively speaking. I'm sure they have thought to themselves, how is it that Google has as the opening page a blank piece of paper with a search box? No real graphics, but there's the search engine of the world collecting human knowledge. Yeah. And there's no graphics. And even when you type in a search term, you don't get graphics, you get some text back. I mean, it's funny in a way because we look at it and say there's so many better ways to present the density of information that Google is coming back with. But so far, they have not been savvy to providing that kind of graphical display. It's shocking to me.
Well, it's very tricky. And as you know, we've been working on that. Yeah. And there's infographics, I think what you're talking about, and that's, you can have templates and fill them in with information in certain ways. But what we're working on is, what, if you have raw text, what symbols come out of that automatically, and how semantically can you arrange information so it makes sense within the graphics? It's a challenge. People are working on it. We're feeling really good about it for our communication. But I did want to say that, interestingly, then these days I get to work with People-Centered Internet. That's one of my nonprofits, founded by Vince Cerf, who is another big wave on this. It's like Engelbart, Vince Cerf, and then you get this later wave, the giant wave from those internet and the tools that Doug did. Interestingly, both
I'm going to put up a second piece as you talk, because you gave me all of them, and I of course downloaded them in a slightly different order. But let me put up the next one, because essentially there's 4 pieces, and the pieces kind of link together. And if you look at what's going on, it's really this shift of the knowledge age, the information age to the knowledge age, and then the knowledge age to what might be called more the conceptual age, right? And there's a lot of detail in this, and there's a lot of little aspects of things that are going on in different periods of time. I always think of it as like the mainframe period versus the mini computer period versus the personal computer period versus the network computer period versus just the sort of like cloud period where it's just all over the place. Computational intelligence is almost like electricity out of a jack in the wall. you don't even need to have a computer per se. You can have just a pad or a smartphone and get so much information. And I think in a way this graphic does justice to the acceleration of the ability to deliver information over time rapidly when it's needed. And I think that you can only get the visual by looking at the visual, and even looking at it in these pieces probably is disorienting. You have to look at the whole graphic and say, wow, yeah, when he did that demo in 1968, he really was forecasting an immense future. And I think your point is somebody's going to do the demo, the mother of all demos or the father of all demos, part 2. It hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened yet, right? In a way, it really hasn't happened. I mean, people are wondering what it's going to be, because you could argue when he did that demo in 1968, he was saying there is a huge future ahead of us, and a bunch of us see it and a lot of people don't. And strap on your seatbelts, because you're going to be amazed to see what happens over the next few decades. And he was right. Yeah. He was very right. And you actually worked with him, right? Tell us about how that happened. When did you get connected with him?
Let's see. Jim Sporer, who's now at IBM, had something called Education Object Economy about education at the time when things were really changing, and suddenly we were able to provide education. They call them objects in developing world. You could have a bicycle in Vietnam to run the internet. I met Doug through that organization, and Valerie as well. Valerie is a professor at Cal State Monterey Bay at the time, and so she had developed students and a whole community around Doug in his later years around his philosophy. So kind of enabled him to have a voice with the next generation. So that's how we got to know him. We spent many hours with him. It was very delightful.
Did you capture those hours on audio or video or anything like that?
We have so many tapes, and Valerie and I, we're still great friends. We're like, what are we going to do with these? Well, one day it will make sense, because we really should edit them. But yeah, she's a multimedia professor, and she, did videotape everything.
I mean, it seems like you should get a grant from somewhere to just get it all loaded onto one ginormous digital library, and then just cross-index everything to each other and get to the point where I think you saw it at 60 Minutes, they had some of the people from the Holocaust in sort of a robotic way talk about. Did you see that? 60 Minutes? Pretty amazing, right? So I always thought Doug could be like a little robot, and you could get some Doug quotes, just like quotes of famous people, in a way that says you could have a conversation the way I was having the conversation with Google, to sort of say, well, Doug, what do you think if we did X with Y with Z? And maybe you'd get some interesting cross-pollination of ideas as a result, right?
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. I hadn't put that together. Absolutely.
I mean, with your graphic, you've got like this roadmap of how are trends going versus what would Doug say? Because I think he would be a little disappointed by some of the stuff that he would think would be far, far more advanced than what it is today. But maybe I'm overstating it.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about augmenting human intelligence, because that's the term he used for that. Yes. And that when I mentioned Vint Cerf and people-centered internet, he and a number of great innovators in Silicon Valley are all believe in what you described, human augmentation. Peter Norwig, who's a director of research at Google, Adam Shire, who created Siri. Yes. We've all talked about and written about the importance of technology supporting humans and not attempting to supplant. So I think that next wave does involve augmentation and figuring out how that interplay works.
I mean, I'll make a statement and you'll tell me I'm either crazy or overzealous or something, but I say something like, if the video game industry were mapped identically to the productivity software industry, I think the productivity software industry would be 100x more fired up compared to video games, because I think video game industry has become like so advanced, so unbelievably advanced, and yet productivity software, in terms of getting a brief written or a letter written or something done, even in an email, which is pretty fast these days, it's still a lot of, relatively speaking, cycles of getting the words onto the computer, editing them, arranging them, revising them, correcting them. Now people say, well, remember the day where you had a piece of paper and you put it into a typewriter and you rolled the typewriter and you started typing on a typewriter and you used whiteout to correct it. I mean, we're way more advanced, but the video game industry is like super, super advanced, comparatively speaking.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And back in the early 2000s at Institute for the Future, we did a lot of future forecasting on learning and education. And we had people in these three-dimensional worlds, which happened for a while there. And then suddenly those broke off because the entertainment industry, there was more money for entertainment than there was education, of course. And somehow the productivity tools, haven't quite gotten the gist on that. But Bonnie DeVarco, who's another colleague of mine, we worked on something called Shape of Thought about ideas. She was doing these immersive worlds where you would, be able to manipulate objects, communicate. It was really dynamic for productivity.
I mean, I've been talking to different people about whatever happened to the notion of having software that does outline, sometimes called outlining software, because we're reviewing some of the old history of the beginning of electronic outlines on computers, separate from word processors, things that just put bullets and sub-bullets, and living video text, and Dave Weiner and Peter Weiner, two brothers that created that company, and a product they had called Think Tank. Those were really very advanced products, but people just didn't buy into the view of outlining. They sort of rather type in Microsoft Word or WordPerfect or some electronic format where you just free flow without structuring information. And of course, the way I learned to write, which was very much in a Jesuit kind of way, was you organize your thoughts in an outline first, and you played with the outline until you actually felt like you had the structure right. And then you started adding words. And this graphic, in a way, represented a lot of structure in thinking about time versus events versus collections of time. I mean, there's a lot of little sub-graphics in it as well. There's a lot of little stories within a story. There's the formation of Google. There's the formation of Wikipedia. There's the formation of Facebook. These little tiny startups, they take a while to grow, and then they become, these major sirens that are like, 90% of what people do are either on Google or Facebook or Amazon or, various communication tools that are out there. And it's a big part of life. And Silicon Valley adapted very quickly as a result of the pandemic. I'm not even sure anyone really had a hiccup. They just went over and said, well, we're going to work by email and phone and by video conferencing, either Zoom or WebEx or one of the other many products that are out there. I'm not sure Silicon Valley really suffered much of a slowdown at all, relatively speaking. I guess we'll figure that out in the next few months or years, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think you have a good point about structure and the role of visuals and create, as you said in the very beginning of the interview, people who speak well and think well have a picture in their minds. So the picture is part of the structure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another one that goes, so I'm going backwards in time instead of forwards, but I'm doing that with a purpose because I want to show people this mural because it really does sort of hang together in a way that sort of shows you that there's connectedness between the periods of time. Now, I have a disjointed connection, but really you're going through and you're going off of the view that he's born in 1925 and you started in 1925, but not a lot is happening because basically we have a war or two between then and, there must have been a lot of retardation for what could have occurred in the information age as a result of World War I and World War II. And of course, we had a major depression as well. And we'll go back to the image. But you get into this period, 1960s, the go-go 1960s, and there he is doing the demo. And it's right here in this image right here of him in 1968, really showing how there's going to be so much that you can do with a computer, which back then, of course, people were still typing on a typewriter, right? Yeah. They were doing paper memos, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you were born yet at that point, but literally, right? You're still very young. But I was just a kid at the time, and I just remember thinking to myself, man, if this computer stuff ever goes anywhere, I want to be part of it. So
wow.
At a very early age, I was very interested in what was happening and what were these companies like IBM doing, because my dad had a grocery store, really a little supermarket, and the cash registers were all starting to recognize that they could be driven by electricity and not be a hand crank. We had a few hand crank cash registers from the 1930s and 1940s, but now these cash registers were getting some intelligence in them where you could actually record daily transactions. And that's the beginning of people realizing that those machines are going to have some intelligence in them. They're going to be able to track things that humans cannot necessarily track as well. So your graphic is right on.
When you had that aha, how old were you when you started thinking about machines being able to help us in that way and think for us a little bit?
Right, because my parents were very much of the view that you must get an education. And they were, of course, born kind of in this time frame. My dad was born in 1925, so he exactly overlaps, I think, when Doug was born. Wasn't Doug born in 1925? Isn't that where you started this?
Yes.
I mean, literally with his birth. And he's sort of an understated pioneer. I think he's actually more important than Steve Jobs, but people would say you're crazy. I think without him, there would be no Apple computer and probably would be no Steve Jobs, or there would be a Steve Jobs, but not at the level that, you know, he has become so famous. Doug Engelbart probably should have been given the Nobel Prize for evaluating and helping us see the future in a way that a lot of other people didn't. I mean, that's a big statement, but I think it's true.
He did get the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Which is worth something.
Yeah, a few, he was recognized quite a bit. But you're right. I think you're right. It could have been a Nobel. Well,
maybe it still can be. I know that Bill Fenwick and I, Bill was a lawyer, our firm, when I was at it, Davis, Stafford, Kelman, and Fenwick, then became Fenwick now, Fenwick and West. Bill Fenwick is still alive, and we talk about these things all the time, and we say Doug was one of those brilliant people we ever met. And of course, we also started Apple Computer with Jobs and Wozniak. They were just kids. And of course, Jobs and Wozniak became far more famous than Doug and far richer than Doug for sure. But, I think Doug had so many seminal ideas that made its way eventually into the Lisa and then into the Macintosh, and still is playing a role probably in the Macintosh computing system as well. And probably will play a role into their augmented reality glasses whenever they come out. Apparently, it's going to happen pretty soon, and we'll see how that plays out.
I think this might be an urban legend, but since you're an attorney, you might know if this really happened. That there was a debate or a lawsuit between Apple and Microsoft of who did something first.
Yes.
And one of Doug's team came in and said, "You're both wrong." Doug thought both of them.
Right. That's right, because Xerox then had a case as well, and you could argue a lot of this stuff happened at SRI before it happened at Xerox. There's a long chain of events. We can talk in another podcast about all the legal stuff, but on the science stuff, I mean, Doug is the brilliance that gets to the point of doing the mother of all demos, and that inspires people like the equivalent of the space race, the equivalent of Kennedy saying we're going to put a man on the moon that inspired so much. I think Doug inspired so many people in so many different ways, including both you and me. We've run out of time today, but we've got all the murals now. I hope we can drill down on different pieces of these murals, because this is your work. This is your piece of art. You are the author and co-author, and you and your partner, I think, did the whole thing, right? You had some other contributors, but it's basically your work, right?
Valerie and me, yep.
I mean, it's a huge endeavor, and to me, it should be taught in every high school. I've been thinking about doing overseas. I teach overseas at business schools and law schools. I've been thinking about using this mural as a teaching tool for how would you recreate Silicon Valley, say, in Eastern Europe, or even in Russia. Even in Russia, where I've taught, even in Moscow, they want to know, what's the magic of Silicon Valley? I think this mural, to some degree, is suggestive of what ingredients do you need to put together to get a Silicon Valley from a geographical point of view to become more of a conceptual point of view. You follow what I'm saying? People are trying to figure out what's the mixture, what goes into the soup, what goes into the formula, and they can't figure it out. But I think this mural, if studied in detail enough, will help people figure out what that is. And it's a combination of a lot of different things, all synergistically working together. So, Eileen, I want to thank you. Why don't you tell folks how they reach you? Because you do these murals for people at events and at meetings, even board meetings and the like, including on Zoom, right?
Yes, and my company is Visual Insight, and it's visualinsight.net.
Yes.
Is my company, and my name, my first name, Eileen.
Yes.
At visualinsight.net. That's how to find me. I
think it's great. And, I have an idea for you we could talk offline about, but I think for like the podcast purpose, I want to send you some sampling of my podcast. I keep thinking there's a mural that should be developed as kind of a way to suggest how the podcast is trying to describe Silicon Valley. We call it the Valley Current. And it's a way to try to say there's a lot of pieces to Silicon Valley. It's not just computers, it's not just software, it's not just universities, it's not just people making money, it's not just Facebook. It's so many things converging together to bring a group of people together in a way that creates a density of knowledge and maybe even some wisdom to help predict and influence the future in a positive way. And it's probably what we really need in Washington, D.C. If I had to say, where should we replace Silicon Valley first, or extend Silicon Valley? Like if Bezos said to me, I want to create Silicon Valley both in Seattle as well as on the East Coast, I would say, go to Washington, D.C., man. Let's try to replace that place with a place of innovation in government, like e-government. And we probably would get pushed out of town, but we would really die trying to make this happen. And if he does anything with his money, I would say he should figure out a way to bring a lot of e-government and a lot of smart services to citizens that enable a much more advanced way to look and preserve our democracy. But that's a different soapbox. I hope
I know more about that.
Okay, good. So I'm going to send you a schedule, and maybe we could do at least a few more of these, because there's so much in each one of these chapters, and there's at least 5 of them, and we've kind of introduced them. And maybe we could go through them in some detail and go through what you were trying to convey during this first segment, going from the agricultural age to the industrial age, and then you're going to head from the industrial age to the information age, and you're going to head from there to the next age. And all of those ages have different stories to tell, and this is so rich in information and so valuable. So thank you for being on.
And thank you so much for...
Oh, you're welcome. I'll send you the link, and you should put it on your website, and hopefully we can also help you sort of do other things with what you're doing, because I think there are a lot of good ideas here.
Thank you, Jack.
Oh, you're welcome. Have a good day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Bye.
Tune in next time on the Valley Current.